Hey, thanks for joining. There's three really important stages of the process for me when it comes to photography, and they are capturing the image, probably the most fun part of the process, editing the image, and then printing the image. It's nothing like having a hard copy of the photo that you took. Now, some people believe that straight out of camera is the only pure form of photography. They're wrong. A raw image is not designed to be viewed. It just doesn't have the punch. It just doesn't have the contrast. It's just not meant for viewing. A JPEG or similar is an edited picture. We've just let the camera do the work rather than making the decisions ourselves. So for me, editing is a critical stage of producing the image that you wanted to produce, that you had in your mind's eye when you were on the ground. So today we're going to edit one of the pictures that we took last week at Mariavale Bird Sanctuary, just an hour south of Johannesburg. It's a fantastic location if you ever get the chance. And last week we had fantastic weather, we had really nice light, and some fantastic species showed up and made an appearance, including my personal highlight of the day, which was an African marsh harrier, which was superb. I'm going to edit the picture today in Adobe Lightroom. Now, it's not intended as a full tutorial. Each of you will be at different stages of your journey with Adobe Lightroom. Some of you may never have used the package before, some of you will be professional. And there are videos designed and tailored just for you. Whatever your level is, you'll be able to find tutorials that will take you that next step. Having said all of that, there are no rights and wrongs. There are no hacks that the pros don't want you to see. There are no hints and tips that'll change your photography world. Each element of Adobe Lightroom that you learn and master will just improve your end image an incremental amount each time, and over time, with lots of practice, you will be happier and happier and happier with your final outcomes. So today I'm going to show you how I edit my photos, and of course the workflow is slightly different for each image depending on the needs, but what I'm showing you today is pretty much my standard workflow in Lightroom. So let's get started. So let's open Adobe Lightroom, and here we are in the develop module of Lightroom, and there's an image that we took last week of a heron. This is called a Squacco Heron. I'm not 100% certain I'm pronouncing that correctly, but let's go with Squacco Heron. It's actually a nice image, but as I said earlier, a raw file is not designed to be the final product. And in this particular case, whilst I don't dislike the image at all, I think it's got a really nice, dreamy, ethereal look to it. It just lacks punch. So we're going to make some pretty quick changes. It won't be a long edit. As I say, I like the image, but we're just going to make that a bit more punchy. My first port of call would normally be the crop tool, but in this case I quite like the composition. It's pretty much on the rule of thirds. We'll just check that. Yeah, I like the aspect ratio, so I'm not going to change that. Compositionally, this plant across its head isn't ideal, but I think it captures the bird in its environment quite nicely. It's not across the eye, it's not across the beak, so I'm quite happy with that. So in the basic panel, I'm not going to change the exposure. I'm quite happy with the exposure. Contrast, I tend not to use a huge amount. I'm going to reduce the highlights actually quite a bit. It's quite bright at the front of the bird here, so just taking the edge off of that. No need to move shadows. There's not huge patches of dark or shadow areas in this image. I'm going to move the whites up a touch, and I'm going to move the blacks down a touch. Now that's an example of where I've acted on default. I'm not going to move the blacks down. That would be the standard to increase the dynamic range, but actually I'm going to move the blacks in the opposite direction. I'm going to enhance this ethereal, dreamy look, painterly almost, and I quite like that. Not touching texture, not touching clarity or dehaze. Going to leave the colouring for now and go straight into tone curve, which is where I try and get the contrast as I want it. And fairly standard, 90% of videos you watch will talk about the S curve. So let's just play with the contrast a bit. Too much. That's fine. You saw that changed the colours, the saturation, the vibrancy of the colours. You've got to be careful of that. And if you don't want that to happen at all, you can move this slider all the way to the left. In my case, I'm just going to make it a bit more subtle. Move it down 74, 75, that's fine. Okay. I'm going to go into masks. I'm going to select the subject, and it's done a reasonably good job of selecting the heron. Quick trick, if you want to subtract, try subtracting the background first. And in this case, it made a small difference, but marginal. So in this case, we're going to have to use the brush. Let's do that and just subtract the areas that you don't want to be included in the selection, and do this fairly quickly. And there we have it. We've got a reasonable selection of the heron. And for the heron, I'm going to darken the exposure a little, and I'm going to use the contrast slider, which I don't use as a overall adjustment, but within the mask I'm happy to do that. I'm happy with the highlights, I'm happy with the shadows. I'm just going to bring the blacks down a little bit just to try and get that punch into the bird, and I'm going to add a little bit of texture, not a huge amount, a little touch of clarity. And I quite like that. I quite like that. Second mask, in this case a radial gradient, and I'm going to add a radial gradient to add some light coming in from this corner. Just adjust that slightly and bring that down. And drag that all the way across, and then I'm going to subtract the subject from that radial mask, and I'm going to apply some dehaze. You can see that it's very tempting to really increase that, but I don't think I want to go more than 35. And then in colour, I'm just going to warm that up a touch. Don't go overboard. I think that's quite nice. And then I want to add a vignette, but I don't want to add a vignette using the standard tool. I want to add my own in more control. So I'll add a radial gradient covering the bird. And I'm going to invert that mask and bring down the exposure. I think it will take a fairly significant change there. That's too much. So just under one stop. And I'm going to reduce the saturation a little bit just to try and bring the eye into the subject. which is already been done by the use of the light and the darkening of the outside of the image, but now also trying to do that by bringing the eye in with colour in the centre of the image where the subject is. Final mask, which is also a radial gradient, and I'm just going to select the head of the bird, and I'm just going to add a little bit of exposure, a little bit of brightness, brighten that up a touch, not too much, a little bit on the whites, and I'm going to add some saturation just to try and bring the colour, those yellows out in the base of the beak and in the eye. See the impact that that has? It's subtle, but I prefer it that way. So I think I'm pretty happy with that as a final image. So let's look at a before and after. So as you can see, the raw image, it's not an unpleasant image at all. I'm not dissatisfied with it, but it lacks punch, it lacks impact. And I think with a little bit of tweaking, a few edits, nothing major, nothing drastic, nothing complicated or complex, the subject really pops much more after the edits. So I'm happy with that. Thank you very much for joining. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment section below and I'll be sure to come back to you. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something from it, or at least it sparked an interest or an area for you to go and investigate a little bit further. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing you soon.